Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. U.S. President Donald Trump's former personal lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen delivered a scathing indictment of the president, calling him a con man and a cheat in his testimony on Capitol Hill. Today we discuss the various scandals and controversies surrounding the president, including his plan to build a wall on the Mexican border. For that, we'll sit down with Mason Ricci, the Associate Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for joining us again, Mason.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
On February 27th, when President Donald Trump was absent from the White House due to a summit in Vietnam, Trump's former personal lawyer Michael Cohen testified in front of the U.S. Congress. While President Trump had insisted that he had no business connections with Russia, Cohen, on the other hand, told the congressional hearing that Trump was very hands-on in his negotiations with Russia and building a Trump Tower in Moscow during the 2016 presidential election.
I am ashamed because I know what Mr. Trump is. He is a racist, he is a con man, and he is a cheat.
While Cohen was initially set to testify on February 7th, he postponed the meeting to the 27th, saying his family was under threat. President Trump also seemed to be highly concerned with the details of the hearing, even from afar, as it could potentially drive him into a corner. In fact, Trump even tweeted just 2 hours before meeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, bashing Cohen's character, and further expressed his discomfort at a press conference held after the Hanoi summit.
But I think having a fake hearing like that and having it in the middle of this very important summit is really a terrible thing.
After returning home, President Trump took a more aggressive approach. He posted 5 tweets in a row on March 1st, denouncing Cohen as a fake and saying he was lying a lot. President Trump continues to claim that he did not collude with Russia in the 2016 presidential election, despite the ongoing scandals that continue to make headlines. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we take a closer look at President Trump's current political situation and Michael Cohen's confession that shook America.
All right, so President Trump is facing a lot of scandals, a lot of controversies. So what are the most pressing ones?
How much time do we have? He has a lot of them at the moment. I think the 2 biggest ones probably are going to be whatever comes out of the Mueller report, and we're not sure when that's going to come out, but in principle it might be relatively soon. And if that implicates either Trump personally or his family members or his campaign team from 2016, more largely in the Russian effort to influence illegally the 2016 U.S. presidential election, obviously that would be a bombshell. And then the second thing are the congressional oversight investigations, which are now going to become increasingly broad-based. Not only will they involve obstruction of justice charges potentially for the unlawful removal of Attorney General James Comey, as well as other possible obstruction of justice violations as well. But they're going to begin to look at his tax records. They're going to be looking at basically every part of his presidency and his campaign. So those are, I think, the 2 major issues, and just within the context of his governance as well. The White House is going to be playing defense for the foreseeable future, which means that the Trump administration is going to have a hard time moving forward on its legislative agenda, which is already restricted, of course, because the Republicans don't control the House of Representatives at the moment.
President Trump's relationship with Russia is not news to us. We all know that it has been going on for over 2 years. But why is this becoming such a big issue right now?
Yeah, I think it's become a bigger issue again for 2 reasons. The first of which is that Cohen's testimony in the Congressional Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives implicated, even through just Cohen's suspicions, to use his term, Trump as an active conspirator potentially with Russia to influence the election. It wasn't direct. It was through one of Trump's other agents, Roger Stone, as well as some other ancillary figures. And it doesn't seem to be the case that Cohen provided any corroborating evidence, but bringing that up again, even if it's just in the form of suspicions, has put that on the table. And then secondly, you have the Mueller report, which again will be coming out relatively soon, which in legal terms is actually a counterintelligence investigation, and its attempt to try to figure out how it is that the Russians influenced the 2016 presidential election has eventually led to implicating the Trump campaign in that effort as well.
Right. President Trump, though, he has been referring to all these scandals, controversies as a witch hunt. And then in the meanwhile, we hear from Michael Cohen in front of the Congressional hearing. He said that he called him a con man and a cheat, a number of things. So who should we really believe?
Neither of these men are at all credible. In Cohen's case, he's going to be going to prison for lying to Congress. And in Trump's case, the lies that he spouts out daily have been going on for so long, both during his presidency, during his campaign, and obviously even prior to that, that one hardly even knows where to begin. And in some sense, they're even obvious. And the lies, he doesn't even necessarily try to hide that they're lies in some ways. So I wouldn't believe either of these men, and not only is that because of their history, but also the incentives that they have currently to continue lying. In Cohen's case, he's trying to rehabilitate his reputation in some way, and ironically, it may well be the case that he has to lie in order to do that, because he's going to try to portray himself in a positive light as he attempts to rehabilitate his reputation. And in Trump's case, he has his presidency to save, he has potential re-election worries in front of him, and so he also will attempt to exonerate himself both politically and legally from many of the charges that he will be facing either from the Mueller investigation fallout or from Congressional investigation. So both of them have an incentive to continue lying. So I wouldn't believe either of them unless there is extensive corroborating evidence, either direct or circumstantial, to support the things that they say.
On February 15th, Trump declared a state of national emergency after the budget to build a border wall had been significantly reduced.
We fight wars that are 6,000 miles away, wars that we should have never been in many cases, but we don't control our own border. So we're going to confront the national security crisis on our southern border.
President Trump planned to spend up to $8 billion to build a wall, which became possible after declaring a national emergency, but the Democratic Party strongly opposed it, and Republicans also voiced concerns. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party continued its offensive against Trump by holding Michael Cohen's hearing at his absence and passing a resolution on February 26th that would nullify the national emergency, which President Trump declared is needed to build a border wall. The U.S. media also covered Cohen's hearing much more extensively than the Hanoi summit. At this, experts say Trump may have been distracted, which in turn could have affected the results. Trump also attacked the Democratic Party and the media via Twitter and did not deny that Cohen's testimony was one reason for the failed talks with North Korea. While President Trump wanted to see a breakthrough in domestic politics with his diplomatic achievements, the second Kim-Trump summit concluded without an agreement. His own party is deeply divided over the wall budget, and the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, which is in charge of the impeachment process, has also launched a major investigation into the president, deeply threatening his political standing. Would he be able to flip the game and turn the situation around?
So to glean more information about the current situation in the U.S., joining us now is Steve Herman, the White House Bureau Chief of VOA News. Thank you for joining us again, Steve.
My pleasure.
President Trump is reacting quite sensitively to Michael Cohen's House hearing. Is it because it's impactful enough to hurt President Trump's current political standing?
Well, as you know, President Trump tends to react quickly and vociferously to many things, both big and small. This one obviously ranks a little bit bigger than most because it is someone who was a former confidant of his testifying before a congressional committee. But as the president and others in his administration have pointed out, Michael Cohen cannot be trusted because he lied before to Congress. So why take him at his word this time? So they feel that he's pretty easy to knock down. But on the other hand, there is a very strong concern in the White House that evidence that the president's former personal lawyer has could be quite damaging to President Trump.
Michael Cohen he was pled guilty last year because of these lies that he told about the Moscow project last year. But it seems like people are more believing what he has said in the recent testimony rather than those who are opposing to him. So what is really shaking up America right now?
Well, America is very captivated by the Trump presidency, whether people are in favor of Donald Trump or strongly oppose him. And the country is very polarized. And the Michael Cohen testimony was one of the latest significant chapters in this national soap opera that's been playing out since 2016 and is going to go through 2020. And with Cohen, as I mentioned, because he was so close to Donald Trump for so long, even putting aside what he may be saying and whether you believe it or not, access that he has to documentation, whether that be paperwork or audio recordings, could be very damaging to the president in legal ways.
Let's go a little back to the Hanoi summit. President Trump had said that he had to leave and walk away from the deal because North Korea wanted all these sanctions to be lifted. But then after that, when he went back to Washington, he is rather accusing the Democrats being the source of why he had to leave this deal. So do you see any links to that?
Well, I think it's quite a stretch to link the testimony of Michael Cohen and the Democrats planning that for that particular time with the collapse of the summit to a lot of observers of this issue. This summit seemed somewhat to be doomed to failure because there were no preliminary agreements. Usually when you get two leaders together in the same room, all of the work has really been done beforehand, and they're in that particular room for more ceremonial than other purposes, and that wasn't the case. There was a high degree of confidence among Donald Trump and some of the people around him that once he got in the room with Kim Jong-un for the second summit, that they could close this deal. But the two countries were very far apart, obviously, on the issues of sanctions and denuclearization. And perhaps because the second summit has not gone forward, this will allow now more pragmatic negotiations among mid-level negotiators from both countries to proceed out of the spotlight, take their time. They won't be under some sort of rush deadline. And so there are those who do have some glimmer of optimism that now something really can be achieved in the future, although there are other people, of course, pessimists who have said, look, every time that the United States and North Korea have tried to work out a deal, even when something has been signed, North Korea has not ended up complying with the terms of those agreements, and we've gone back to square one, essentially.
Thank you. That was Steve Herman, White House Bureau Chief of VOA News in Washington, D.C. Now, Mason, what did you think about Steve's analysis on the Hanoi summit, links to it to the testimony of Michael Cohen?
I basically agree. We have this expression in English, I believe it was President Truman who first came up with this slogan, "The buck stops here." It was a desk ornament, I believe, that he put on his presidential office desk in the Oval Office. I could be wrong about the president, but I think it was Truman. And the idea was, the decisions that are made, for the country are the responsibility of the president, even if he's not the one who actually makes the decision. Ultimately, he carries the responsibility. And I guess with Trump, the buck stops somewhere else. And at first, I had a hard time figuring out the connection, in Trump's mind between Cohen and what would have happened at the Hanoi summit. At first, I thought he just meant perhaps that he was distracted by the ongoing investigation, but that would be a really strange thing to say because essentially that's highly damaging politically to say that he could be so easily distracted. I think actually what he might have been trying to say is that scheduling this potentially embarrassing oversight investigation and Cohen's testimony at the same time that Trump would be abroad for this Hanoi summit was an intentional ploy by the Democrats to weaken Trump. And that, in fact, it would embolden Kim and the North Korean regime to make offers that would force Trump into a bad decision, either to accept a bad deal or to let the Hanoi summit collapse. I'm not going to say that that didn't happen. That's a plausible step that the Democrats could have taken. They're also rough and tumble political players, and they want to score points by embarrassing Trump. But we don't have any evidence of that. And I ultimately agree with Steve Herman that at the end of the day, the Hanoi summit was a failure because of inadequate preparation on both sides, but of course also that of the U.S., and also of Trump's hubris in scheduling this leader-level summit in the way that it was done in the first place.
Okay, let's connect to another expert in New York. We continue our discussion with an expert in New York. Joining us now is Donald Green, professor of political science at Columbia University. Welcome, Professor.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are also waiting for special counsel Robert Mueller to put the finishing touches on his team's nearly two-year investigation into President Trump's various scandals. How big of an impact do you think it's going to make once it's made public?
Well, if it's made public, there's no guarantee that the Mueller report will be made public. It's really going to be up to the Attorney General. And I would say that the probability that it is released to the public in full is proportional to the extent to which it is making serious allegations against Trump. I mean, to the extent that the report recommends indictments or suggests that President Trump had a direct hand in unlawful activity, it's well within the Attorney General's power to quash it. I think that we only hear about it directly if it has relatively little damning information against President Trump.
Do you think there is a possibility President Trump might face impeachment issue once again now?
I think that it could. It certainly is an issue that was revived after the Cohen hearings, because in those hearings, President Trump's former lawyer alleged that he had committed several crimes, including several felonies. And so to the extent that that testimony implicated President Trump in unlawful activity and then results in a series of further investigations, impeachment in the American system is one thing, and conviction of impeachable offenses is another. Recall that in American politics, the House is the one that impeaches, but the Senate is required to convict. And no president has ever been convicted in the history of the country.
You just mentioned about impeachment and conviction. Walk us through the process of that.
Yeah, well, there are no articles of impeachment on the table, but there are many Democratic members of the House of Representatives who would very much like to have hearings to impeach President Trump. I think that the Cohen hearings have, in some sense, revived talk of impeachment because the allegations in those hearings involved multiple felonies, of which President Trump is said to be a direct contributor, involving taxes, involving misallocation of charity finances, things like that. So the case that in the wake of the Cohen hearings, House committees have moved to subpoena documents related to the allegations. Now, House impeachment proceedings tend to drag on and are quite a political spectacle. We will certainly know well in advance if they're likely to move forward. But even if they do carry the House, remember that the House impeaches, but the Senate then has a trial, and it's only upon conviction with 2/3 majority that the president is actually removed from office, and that has never happened in American history.
Thank you very much, Professor Donald Green from Columbia University. Mason, do you agree with his opinions on impeachment of President Trump?
That's absolutely correct. And of course, it's simply the case that the Attorney General is appointed by the president and serves, as we say, at the pleasure of the president. And so Barr presumably would do the president's wishes, including not releasing the report if that were what President Trump wanted. Alternately, Barr could resign in protest, at which point his position would presumably be filled in an acting capacity by someone who would again do what it is that Trump wanted to do. That would presumably be the most important qualification for the job. So obviously that's true, and in general I agree that it is less likely that the report, at least in an unredacted form, would be released if it's heavily damaging to Trump. I think that that's true. Where I think maybe we should look for an alternate way that this information might make it into the public is through a leak. I don't necessarily think that Mueller himself would do that. I think that Mueller has a reputation for integrity and probity, which is almost second to none among those who have ever worked in the U.S. government in the modern period. But it would not surprise me if one of his lieutenants, perhaps, were to leak this document to the public. And then we would have a real bombshell and a real scandal. So I think that's a possibility. As for impeachment, I think that we have to remember that impeachment is a political and constitutional remedy, not a legal remedy. And whether or not the Democrats in the House choose to move forward with articles of impeachment is not simply related to the question of whether or not Trump committed felonies sufficient to meet the standard of high crimes and misdemeanors defined in the Constitution, but also the political calculus of what this will mean for the Democrats in 2020 and beyond. And I think that there is a division right now among the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives, where you have particularly some younger and more radical members of the House Democratic caucus who would be interested in moving forward on articles of impeachment under certain circumstances if the potential wrongdoing on Trump's part were significant enough. And then I think you have a more cautious institutional side of the Democratic caucus, probably led by Nancy Pelosi and many of her lieutenants, who probably are looking at this with a much more cold-eyed approach. And my guess is they're probably less interested in this because of the potential political cost and political risk that would be involved, especially since conviction is almost certain not to take place.
And whether the impact is big or small, President Trump is still at a crossroads with all these investigations, but also with state administration. He has been saying that he will build a wall in the Mexican border, and he has been saying that since he got into the office. So wasn't that his actually key agenda during his campaign pledges?
It was, and he based a significant part of his campaign on this idea. And the fact that he's had to use emergency powers, an executive order invoking national emergency powers in order to shift funds around from department to department in order to build a part of this wall or barrier or a fence or whatever the term of the day is really a testament to how shambolic his administration is. They had 2 years where Trump was in the White House and the Oval Office. The Republicans controlled the House and the Senate. They were unable to pass legislation through the normal appropriations process that would allow them to build this wall. So really this speaks enormously to the incompetence of the Trump White House over the first couple of years, as well as to the larger Republican caucus in both the House and the Senate. And I should also point out, Trump is really lucky that voters have a short memory. Most people by now have even forgotten that, in fact, his pledge during the 2016 campaign was not that he would build the wall and that the U.S. government would pay for the wall, but rather that Mexico would pay for the wall. So that we've gone from that campaign pledge to having to use an extremely constitutionally dubious invocation of the National Emergency Act powers in order to fund this wall is really a humiliating political climb down.
Okay, thank you very much for your insights today.
No worries. Happily done.
President Trump has been embroiled in a number of controversies since he was elected into the Oval Office. We'll have to wait and see whether President Trump will be able to break free or succumb to this unending chain of allegations. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in, and see you again next week.